So our next speaker will be Scott Miller, also from the BLM's National Operations Center, where he's an aquatic ecologist, and he's coming to talk about informing the condition of BLM natural resources from permitted uses to national level reporting. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Sarah. Before we get into the data-driven talks of the symposium, I want to build a little bit on Emily's introduction and talk about how we are using those principles of AIM to meet some of our monitoring requirements, all the way from scales of individual restoration, reclamation projects up to national level reporting. As Emily highlighted, as a multiple use mandated agency, managing lots of lands from Alaska to New Mexico, we have a lot of different data needs driven by different policy requirements. Emily highlighted FLIPMA at the national scale. We also have the Public Rangelands Improvement Act. Both of them mandate that we will maintain an up-to-date inventory of rangeland resources as well as their condition and trend. So at the broadest spatial scale, we have national level reporting requirements. At the scale of individual field offices, we have resource management plans developed. This is how we're going to implement a multiple use mandate. We specify what permitted uses we're going to allow, where we're going to allow them, and what some of our other resource values are. So we have policy related to not just developing those plans, but assessing the implementation of those plans as well as the effectiveness. And recent policy in 2016 to use the Bureau's AIM strategy to assess RMP effectiveness. So this can go all the way down to the scale of individual permitted uses. In the case of grazing, we can think about the BLM's fundamentals of land health and needing to do land health assessments to assess the sustainability of current grazing practices in light of other values for the landscape, as well as all the way down to individual treatments. Are we getting bang for our buck with our restoration and reclamation efforts, whether in terrestrial systems or aquatic systems? And so as Emily highlighted, historically, a lot of these different needs, because of the different policy drivers, were kind of siloed, and we had different monitoring programs developed to address different monitoring needs at different spatial scales. When in reality, if we look at these from a terrestrial perspective, a lot of them share a lot of commonalities. Whether you're on the North Slope of Alaska and wanting to understand climate change impacts all the way down to reclamation effectiveness in New Mexico, you're probably concerned about vegetative composition, location, cover type attributes. Whereas if you're working in aquatic ecosystems, we've had the Clean Water Act in place since the 1970s, mandating that we look at different chemical, physical, and biological attributes of stream and river ecosystems, whether you're working in forests of Western Oregon all the way to the plains of Eastern Montana and Wyoming. So as Emily highlighted, and for anybody that came into the room, I'll just recap a couple of her points, that AIM is seeking to meet these multiple data needs using a consistent approach with the goal of increasing the effectiveness and efficiencies of our assessment and monitoring activities, and ultimately the defensibility of our management actions. The theme of the SRM conference is empowerment through applied science. And Emily highlighted the 5 principles of the AIM strategy, and I think this is a great embodiment of how the BLM is empowering management decisions through applied science. There has been decades of research into what to monitor, how to monitor it, to maximize accuracy and precision, to minimize observer bias, and to characterize those critical ecosystem attributes that we need to maintain our multiple use mandate. Just like with where and how to locate sample points, the advent of spatially balanced random sampling protocols in recent years is a great example of how the BLM is applying current science to optimize where they invest monitoring on the landscape, all the way down to some of the remote sensing talks that we're going to see today on how field-based data is being used to calibrate things like wind erosion models and national vegetative maps. So what I'd like to do for my talk today is highlight why those 5 principles are important, how they're being used throughout the Bureau to address a multitude of different management questions, and really focus on flexibility in their application, how a structured implementation approach is used to make decisions regarding what you measure, where you measure it, and, for example, if remote sensing can play a role in your project. So before I do that, I want to highlight 2 sets of terms so that we make sure that when I use these terms throughout the talk that we're on the same page. One of them is related to the principle of what to measure and how to measure it, and it's this idea of core versus supplemental indicators. This idea that we think about core indicators as some measurable ecosystem attribute that has broad applicability across ecosystems, policy, management objectives. Again, whether you're working on the North Slope of Alaska, forest of Western Oregon, or all the way down to New Mexico, that there's certain attributes that make sense. So terrestrial example is something like vegetative composition, and aquatics, we might think about stream temperature. A lot of the species that we're trying to manage for are ectotherms, and thus knowing something about the thermal environment is critical to population viability. In contrast to core indicators, we have supplemental indicators. These might not make sense to measure everywhere. They might be too expensive, or the attribute just might not make sense. So example is something for terrestrial ecosystems is something like sagebrush shape. If you don't have sagebrush, or you're not managing for species dependent upon sagebrush, quantifying sagebrush shape might not make sense. So we're going to see some applications today of how to meet different management and monitoring objectives, people have added supplemental indicators because the core indicators did not cover some of their data needs. So we have core and we have this idea of supplemental indicators. Another set of definitions is this idea related to where and how to locate sample points. So this idea of where are you driving the truck to? Is it done through purposive sampling, sometimes known as targeted sampling, where the sampler is deliberately picking a sample location because of a concern that they have on the landscape, and your inference isn't much beyond where you collected your data? Or are you implementing some type of probabilistic sampling approach where you take a very systematic approach to defining your target population, what members are in that target population, and each one of those members or sample units has some probability of being selected? So this idea of purposive versus probabilistic sampling and how we use these different techniques in a structured implementation approach to address different management objectives. So to do this, I've got a series of slides that are going to get a little bit repetitive, but I hope they're going to prove a point. So we're going to start out at the top with a monitoring objective. In this case, to report nationally on the condition and trend of the chemical, physical, and biological condition of stream and river ecosystems. I'm going to present a series of aquatic examples, but try and intersperse some terrestrial corollaries. You could replace this with terrestrial vegetative composition, soil and site stability. And then I'm going to highlight things like the methods, the design, remote sensing, and data capture and storage, and highlight for different monitoring objectives at different spatial scales how we have similarities and differences. So at the broadest spatial scale, trying to report nationally on the condition and trend of BLM terrestrial or aquatic resources, we're going to implement those core indicators. They were designed to have broad applicability. Because we seek to speak to thousands of acres or tens of thousands of stream kilometers, very large populations, we're going to implement probabilistic sample designs. So we can collect data at a small number of sites and make inference to a large number. From a remote sensing standpoint, we're going to see how some of these national data sets are being used to train remotely sensed map products. And we're going to have a couple talks on that throughout the special session. And then both for the aquatic and terrestrial, we utilize electronic data capture as well as centralized data storage, and that's what Sarah and Aquadat are for aquatic ecosystems respectively, and DEMA and Terradat for terrestrial. So each time I go to a next slide, if there's any change, it'll be highlighted in red. So in this case, under public land statistics, we also need to report at the state scale, and not much changes between national and state-based reporting. In this case, I just highlighted how remote sensing can aid in setting site potential. We can take a sample point, we can delineate its watershed, we can compute things like watershed area, precipitation, geology, other climatic factors to set potential natural conditions for a stream site and understand whether observed conditions deviate from expectations. What I really want to highlight from this slide is that you remember we had 300 some odd points for what was called the Western Rivers and Streams Assessment. Well, 40 some of those points fell in the state of Idaho. Idaho wanted to do a state-based assessment. The first thing they did is say, what can we gain from other AIM data collection efforts that have already occurred? Because we use the same core methods for national level reporting, we implemented a probabilistic sample design. The state of Idaho was basically able to take those points from a national level reporting, recycle them, add some additional points in red, and do a state-based assessment. So this idea that if we implement standard methods and probabilistic sample design, we can essentially repurpose those points. we can repurpose them at successively smaller spatial scales. So we have the salmon field office here nested within the state of Idaho. And in this case, they are conducting an AIM project to assess resource management plan effectiveness, specifically addressing different aquatic and habitat management objectives. So in this case, again, they were utilizing the core methods, but they have some fish species of management concern in that field office. And therefore, some of the regional monitoring programs and some of their biological opinions specify the need to focus on an indicator called pool tail fines. How much fine sediment is there in a system and where is it accumulating? Well, pool tails is a good kind of the canary in the coal mine for fine sediment. So when they started implementing AIM at the field office scale, they've added some supplemental indicators to address other management applications at that spatial scale. You'll note, it's hard to see some of them, that I have a mixture of points. There's some of those blue and red points from the Western Rivers and Streams Assessment, national level reporting, state-based reporting. So when they started in salmon, again, the first exercise they did is, what other AIM points do we have in our field office that were collected in some unbiased way because we can recycle those points? So the salmon field office is able to do some of that, the resource management plan objectives, expending about half the effort that they would because they're recycling data from broader spatial scales. At the same time, they have other monitoring programs, PIBO, or the Packfish In-Fish Biological Opinion, trying to manage things like steelhead and different anadromous fish species. BLM and U.S. Forest Service have a collaborative monitoring program in parts of Idaho. And so because we have methods that are now compatible, that the BLM are using, that the Forest Service is also using, we can share some of their data points to increase the precision and accuracy of some of our estimates and for some different applications. We don't make a lot of decisions at the field office scale. Our decisions tend to be at finer scales, and in RMP effectiveness monitoring, we're typically trying to assess the cumulative effectiveness of our management actions. We tend to make more decisions using monitoring data at the scale of permitted uses. In this case, maybe conducting a land health assessment on a grazing allotment or doing some type of watershed scale assessment to assess conditions under the BLM's fundamentals of land health. So in this case, the core indicators all map to the fundamentals of land health. They're quantitative corollaries of things like interpreting indicators of rangeland health or BLM's proper functioning condition protocol. So the core indicators are a way to quantify those more qualitative assessments. But if we're conducting a land health evaluation, there might be some supplemental indicators we want to consider, something like stubble height. Just like the MIM protocol does of can we relate short-term season of use indicators to long-term conditions. So when we get down to the scale of permitted uses, people might start looking at other supplemental indicators that are relevant to the use of interest, in this case, grazing. Now, this is where things start changing from a design perspective considerably. When you get to pretty small spatial scales, people could be implementing a probabilistic sample design if it's a large resource, if it's a very contentious decision, but they might have very little resources or time to make decisions. And so in some cases, they might be utilizing found data. In this case, I've just plotted all the BLM and collective BLM Forest Service sites in that watershed that they have almost a dozen points that you might go through an exercise of what data do we already have on the landscape. Of those sample points, which ones are relevant to grazing? You're not going to assess grazing impacts in a high gradient confined stream channel where cattle can't access. So you might screen your existing data points and ask, are they representative of the use of interest, and say, and conclude, we don't need to collect additional information. Or we need to supplement these, so use purposive sampling to add a couple more points on the landscape in kind of a key area type approach that the BLM commonly implements. But things like remote sensing and data capture and storage, I haven't highlighted data capture and storage too much, but it's pretty much stayed the same across all these spatial scales, that they're utilizing those tools that Emily highlighted. So this is the last spatial scale I want to highlight. The redundancy is over. And this is at the scale of individual restoration or reclamation efforts. So in this case, we're again in the salmon field office. Irrigated agriculture is a dominant land use there on private lands, and a lot of streams that flow across BLM lands are diverted to support that agriculture. And so they have several stream reaches that are completely dewatered. So they have several stream reaches that they're working to get more in-stream flow rights for those systems to support different aquatic benefits. And they want to know what are the benefits of rewatering these stream systems. So in this case, we're assessing the efficacy of different restoration efforts. And this is where methods, you see the most variability in methods, that people might be using the core, they might be adding supplemental, or they might just be using a subset of the core indicators. If you've identified temperature as an issue, and you're trying to restore stream temperature, you might look at riparian vegetation, canopy cover, and stream temperature, but monitoring fine sediment might not have a lot of applicability to that restoration effort. So there is even flexibility in what core indicators you apply. Depending on if you're looking at a population of treatments, you might implement probabilistic sampling, but if it's just one treatment, one kilometer stream reach, you might implement purposive sampling where you sample at the top, middle, and bottom of that stream reach. So idea that as we change spatial scale and we change objectives for collecting data, we might change what we measure and where we measure it, and maybe how we use remote sensing. In this case, they're using remote sensing as a way to quantify changes in riparian extent through time as we re-wet that stream channel. Regardless, all of that data is being stored in our centralized databases. And one of the advantages of this is when you do a restoration or reclamation project, one of the challenges is setting potential. What are we trying to restore it to? Well, if you use the same methods to assess your restoration project that you did to conduct your resource management plan effectiveness, you might have something like fine sediment that's shown here, that we have the natural range of variability throughout the field office as measured by percent fines. You can take your restoration area pre-restoration and say, this is how it compares to the conditions throughout my field office. And you might use that range of variability to set a restoration target. To say it would be great through increasing stream flow and stream power to transport sediment if we could scour out some of those fines and get fine sediment to be within the natural range of variability for stream and river systems throughout my field office. So an example of how even data collected for an individual restoration project can be put into the context of your larger monitoring efforts to set management objectives. So those are a couple abstract examples. I think throughout the rest of the morning and into the afternoon, I'm going to encourage you to think about the core methods and different study designs that the talks are using. And that we're going to see a diversity of application of the core methods, from looking at vegetative treatment effectiveness, to land health assessments, to training, remote imagery, to assessing habitats for species of management concern, and the impacts of different permitted uses on the landscape, all relying on those core methods, but perhaps utilizing different survey designs that a given monitoring objective might necessitate targeted or purposive sampling in some cases, whereas others might be utilizing a stratified random sampling or a control impact design, all tied back to that idea of structured implementation and what is your monitoring and management objective. So in conclusion, I hope I've shared some ideas about how application of the AIM principles are flexible, and that flexible should be driven through structured implementation, specifically your management and monitoring objectives. We have some principles that have high flexibility, things like survey design and the use of supplemental indicators, whereas we have other things that we don't see as much flexibility because of the benefits that can be gained, things like how you measure the core indicators, the methods that you use, and that electronic data capture and storage. We see a lot of benefits of the standardized indicators and methods, whether that's certainty for our permittees in terms of what data they need to collect and what are the standards from which we're going to measure sustainability, to comparisons of data through space and time, as Emily highlighted. I think the real power from an approach like this comes from combining standardized methods with something like probabilistic survey designs, so that we can actually collect data once and use it for multiple applications and gain those efficiencies in data collection in an era of reducing budgets and workforce. And with that, I will take any questions, but I think I only have a minute left.